There are moments in global politics that seem small on the surface: a diplomatic invitation, a scheduled visit, a handshake across an ocean, but carry enormous weight beneath the surface. This is one of those moments. Australia has broken ranks with the Trump administration, extending a formal invitation to Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney to address the Australian Parliament. It is a move that, in any other era, might have been described as routine diplomacy between two close Commonwealth allies. But in the charged, fractured geopolitical atmosphere of 2025, it is anything but routine. It is a statement, a signal, and perhaps the beginning of something much larger. To understand why this matters, you need to understand the world these leaders are navigating. The United States under Donald Trump has returned to its instinct for unilateralism. Tariffs have been reimposed, alliances have been tested, long-standing trade agreements have been challenged or abandoned. Traditional partners, Canada, Australia, the European Union, have found themselves repeatedly blindsided by decisions made in Washington with little consultation and even less warning. The old certainties of the post-war international order, built painstakingly over 8 decades, are being questioned, renegotiated, and in some cases, dismantled in real time. And into this volatile environment, Australia has made a choice. It has looked across the Pacific and across the Atlantic, weighed its options, and decided that the time has come to reinforce its relationships with like-minded democracies, even if that means visibly stepping out of alignment with the Trump White House. Mark Carney is not a conventional politician. He is, in many ways, the archetype of the technocratic statesman, a man forged not in the fires of partisan politics, but in the crucibles of global finance. Before becoming Prime Minister of Canada, Carney served as Governor of the Bank of Canada and then as Governor of the Bank of England, the first non-British person ever to hold that role. He navigated both institutions through periods of extraordinary turbulence: the 2008 financial crisis, the Brexit shock, the economic disruptions of the pandemic era. He did so with a calm, analytical authority that earned him admiration from financial markets and policymakers alike. When Justin Trudeau stepped down and Canada needed steady hands at a moment of domestic uncertainty and external pressure from Washington, Carney was the man the Liberal Party turned to. And since taking office, he has wasted no time in defining what kind of leader he intends to be. Carney has been unambiguous in his response to Trump's trade aggression. When the United States reimposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, steel, aluminum, automotive products, Carney did not flinch. He responded with countermeasures, yes, but more importantly, he responded with a strategic reorientation. Canada, he declared, could no longer afford to be so dependent on a single trading partner. The country needed to diversify, to deepen its ties with Europe, with Asia, with the Commonwealth, with any nation that shared Canada's commitment to rules-based trade, democratic governance, and multilateral cooperation. It was a pivot with enormous implications, and one that found immediate resonance in Canberra. Australia, under Anthony Albanese, has been charting a careful but increasingly confident foreign policy course. After years of diplomatic turbulence, the AUKUS submarine deal, the fallout with China over trade restrictions, the managed recalibration of the relationship with Beijing, Australia has emerged with a clearer sense of where it stands and what it values. It values its alliance with the United States deeply and genuinely, but it also values its sovereignty, its multilateral commitments, and its relationships with partners who share its worldview. And increasingly, Australia is recognizing that maintaining all of those things simultaneously requires a level of diplomatic dexterity that goes beyond simply following Washington's lead. The decision to invite Carney to address Parliament is a product of that dexterity. It is a carefully considered act that communicates several things at once. To Canada, it says, "We see what you are going through. We respect how you are handling it, and we stand with you." To the broader international community, it says, Australia believes in the kind of multilateralism and democratic solidarity that Carney represents. And to Washington, and here is where the real tension lies, it says, we are your ally, but we are not your subordinate. We make our own decisions about who we welcome and who we admire. The Trump administration has not reacted warmly to Carney's emergence on the world stage. This is, perhaps, not surprising. Carney's worldview is in almost every meaningful respect the antithesis of Trump's. Where Trump is skeptical of international institutions, Carney has built his career championing them. Where Trump sees trade as a zero-sum competition, Carney sees it as the architecture of mutual prosperity. Where Trump instinctively retreats from multilateral obligations, Carney instinctively leans into them. The two men represent not just different policy preferences, but different conceptions of what international leadership means. And so, when Australia warmly embraces Carney, invites him to speak not just in a government meeting room, but before the full parliament, a rare and significant honor, it is impossible for Washington to miss the message embedded in that gesture. Addressing a foreign parliament is not something that happens casually. It is reserved for heads of state and government who represent something that the inviting country wants to publicly affirm. Barack Obama addressed the Australian Parliament in 2011, and his speech was remembered as a declaration of the enduring centrality of the American alliance. When Volodymyr Zelensky addressed parliaments around the world via video link in the early months of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, each invitation was a statement of solidarity with a democratic nation under attack. The symbolism is never incidental. It is always the point. So what is Australia saying by extending this honor to Carney? It is saying, at least in part, that Canada's struggle matters, that a country facing economic coercion from its most powerful neighbor, facing tariffs designed not just to alter trade flows, but to bend political will, deserves to be heard, supported, and celebrated on the world stage. There is something genuinely moving about this if you allow yourself to feel it. Canada and Australia are not just treaty partners or trade counterparts. They share something deeper, a colonial heritage they have both grappled with honestly, a commitment to democratic institutions, a tradition of middle power diplomacy, a belief that nations like theirs can and should play a constructive role in shaping the international order, even when they lack the raw military and economic muscle of the great powers. When Australia opens its parliament to Carney, it is, in a sense, one middle power saying to another, "We see you, we recognize what you are fighting for, and you are not alone." The timing of this visit is also significant. It comes at a moment when the global trading system is under extraordinary stress. The reimposition of American tariffs has sent shockwaves through supply chains from Ottawa to Seoul to Sydney. Countries that had built their economic strategies around the assumption of relatively open and rules-governed access to American markets are suddenly being forced to recalibrate. Some are doing so reluctantly, hoping the disruption is temporary. Others are moving more boldly, recognizing that the era of American trade leadership they had counted on may not return in any reliable form. Australia and Canada are both in the latter camp, not hostile to the United States, not seeking confrontation, but unwilling to simply wait and hope that things return to normal. They are building alternatives. And that project of building alternatives is exactly what Carney's visit to Canberra represents. There is also a domestic dimension to all of this that deserves attention. In both Canada and Australia, political leaders are navigating publics that are anxious, uncertain, and hungry for a sense of national purpose and direction. The global disruptions of recent years, the pandemic, inflation, climate shocks, geopolitical instability, have eroded public trust in institutions and created an appetite for leaders who can project confidence and clarity. Carney, with his background in central banking and his reputation for calm competence under pressure, has positioned himself as precisely that kind of leader. And Albanese, by associating Australia so visibly with Carney's brand of measured multilateral democratic leadership, is making a bet about what Australian voters value and what they want their country to represent in the world. It is worth pausing here to consider just how extraordinary the broader context of this moment is. Within living memory, the idea that Australia would make a high-profile diplomatic gesture that could be read as a gentle rebuke of Washington would have been almost unthinkable. The American alliance has been the cornerstone of Australian foreign and defense policy for decades. It survived changes of government, shifts in global power, the rise of China, the rebalancing of the Asia-Pacific. It has been treated by governments of both major parties as essentially non-negotiable, the one fixed point around which all other foreign policy decisions orbit. And yet here we are. Australia is not abandoning that alliance. It is not seeking conflict with Washington, but it is demonstrating quietly and firmly that even the closest of alliances has limits. That there are values and relationships that Australia will not sacrifice on the altar of great power politics. That being a loyal ally does not mean being a silent one. What does Carney himself hope to achieve from this visit? At one level, the practical agenda is clear enough. Canada and Australia have a substantial trade and investment relationship, and both countries have strong interest in deepening it in the context of global trade disruption. They are both major commodity exporters, Canada in energy, minerals, and agricultural products, Australia in iron ore, coal, liquefied natural gas, and agricultural goods. They both face the challenge of managing their relationship with China, their largest or near largest trading partner, at a time when that relationship is fraught with tension and uncertainty. They share membership in numerous multilateral bodies, the G7 in Canada's case, the G20 in both their cases, the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, the Commonwealth. There is genuine substance to develop and genuine interests to align. But beyond the practical, Carney's visit serves a broader strategic purpose. It is part of his effort to demonstrate that Canada, despite the enormous pressure it faces from its southern neighbor, is not isolated. That it has friends, partners, and allies who respect its choices and share its values. Every time Carney stands in a foreign parliament and is received with warmth and honor, it is a message to Canadians that their country still commands respect on the world stage, and a message to Washington that its pressure tactics are not achieving the political isolation of Canada that they might have intended. There is something almost poetic about the geography of this moment. Canada and Australia sit on opposite sides of the world, one in the frozen north of the Americas, one baking in the southern Pacific. They rarely interact directly in the day-to-day headlines of international affairs, and yet they are bound by threads that run surprisingly deep: the English language, the Westminster parliamentary tradition, the Crown, the Commonwealth, the Five Eyes, a shared instinct for pragmatic, non-ideological governance. When leaders of these two nations stand together, there is a resonance to it that goes beyond the formal diplomatic occasion. It is two branches of the same democratic tradition, recognizing each other across a vast and turbulent world. Critics of Australia's move will argue, and some are already arguing, that it is a miscalculation. That provoking Washington's displeasure, however mildly, is never in Australia's strategic interest. That AUKUS, the submarine deal, the deep security and intelligence integration between Australia and the United States, means that Canberra cannot afford the luxury of public gestures that irritate the White House. These are not frivolous concerns. The AUKUS partnership is central to Australia's defense planning for the coming decades. Any serious rupture with Washington would have consequences that go far beyond trade policy. And the Trump administration has shown repeatedly that it is not above using economic leverage, tariffs, market access, investment flows to signal its displeasure with allied governments. But defenders of the decision will say that the opposite risk is equally real. If Australia allows the fear of American displeasure to dictate every diplomatic choice, it sacrifices something fundamental: its credibility as an independent actor, its ability to build the broader network of relationships it needs for long-term security and prosperity, and its standing among the community of democracies that look to middle powers like Australia to help uphold the norms of the international system. There is a version of Australian foreign policy that is so cautious, so deferential, so anxious not to offend Washington that it loses the respect of everyone else. That is not a version of Australian foreign policy that serves Australia's actual interests, and the Albanese government, it seems, is determined not to fall into that trap. What happens next matters enormously. Carney's speech to the Australian Parliament will be watched carefully in capitals around the world, not just for what it says about Canada-Australia relations, but for what it signals about the emerging architecture of democratic solidarity in a world where the old certainties are dissolving. If the visit goes well, If the two leaders emerge with substantive commitments on trade, climate, security, and multilateral cooperation, it could serve as a template for a wider coalition of like-minded democracies navigating the turbulence of the Trump era. If it is received coldly in Washington, it will test the Albanese government's nerve and its willingness to absorb pressure in defense of its principles. But perhaps the most important audience for this visit is not in Washington or Ottawa or Canberra at all. It is the broader international community of nations that are watching somewhat anxiously to see whether the democratic world can hold together under the strain of American unilateralism and great power competition. For smaller and medium-sized democracies, from Europe to Southeast Asia to the Pacific Islands, the question of whether countries like Australia and Canada can maintain their values and their partnerships even under pressure is not just a spectator sport. It is a matter of direct and urgent concern. Because if the middle powers cannot hold the line, if they fold under pressure or retreat into bilateral accommodation with whoever is most powerful at any given moment, then the multilateral order that has underwritten relative peace and prosperity for 8 decades is in serious trouble. Australia, by welcoming Carney, is saying something to all of those watching nations. It is saying that the line will be held, that democratic solidarity is not merely a phrase for good times, but a commitment for hard ones, that the Commonwealth tradition, the multilateral tradition, the tradition of rules-based international order, these are worth defending even when defending them is inconvenient, even when it risks friction with powerful friends, even when the path of least resistance would be to look the other way and say nothing. Mark Carney will walk into the Australian Parliament as the leader of a country under pressure, carrying the hopes of allies and partners who see in his composure and his values a model for how democratic leaders should conduct themselves in difficult times. And Australia, by extending that invitation, will have done something that small gestures sometimes do when the moment is right. It will have said loudly and clearly that in a world full of noise and uncertainty and the temptation of narrow self-interest, some things still matter. Friendship matters. Shared values matter. The courage to stand beside a partner when it costs you something, that matters most of all. This is, in the end, what diplomacy at its best has always been. Not the cold calculation of transactional advantage, but the patient, principled construction of a world where nations can trust one another, where agreements mean something, where the size of your economy does not determine the respect you are owed. Australia and Canada are not superpowers. They will never dictate the terms of the international order on their own, but together and with others who share their values, they can help shape it. They can insist on it. They can model it. And sometimes, in moments like this one, they can remind the world what it looks like when nations choose to lead not with fear, but with principle. The invitation has been extended. The visit will happen. And when Mark Carney stands before the Australian Parliament and speaks, the words he delivers will matter. But so will the simple fact of his standing there at all, welcomed, honored, and recognized as a leader whose vision of the world deserves to be heard. In the complicated, contested, and often dispiriting landscape of global politics in 2025, that is no small thing. In fact, it might be exactly the thing the moment requires.